All around the Caribbean basin, U.S. agents kept Washington informed about the politics of race and labor, even in societies where slavery had been partly or wholly abolished. The fledgling Dominican Republic, which won its independence from Haiti in 1844, attracted pro-slavery attention as a vulnerable white government besieged by the forces of emancipation. In 1845, John C. Calhoun dispatched his political confidant, John Hogan, to Santo Domingo with special instructions to investigate the racial character and composition of the population. Hogan returned a favorable report, noting that the island's blacks have the utmost veneration and respect for their white masters. This only confirmed Calhoun's belief that the United States should cultivate ties with the new regime. The Dominican Republic, he wrote, was of vast importance to us in this continent. It is a reaction against barbarism and an important step should it succeed to maintaining the ascendancy of the more civilized portion of what may more truly be called Spanish America over the less civilized. Concern over hemispheric slavery entailed concern over hemispheric racial hierarchy. In 1844, 2 U.S. envoys to Venezuela, both from slaveholding states, reported civil strife between the white Creole government and the colored people as a class. Birthed by the evil and contagious example of Haiti and nursed on false rumors that the United States had just elected an abolitionist for their president, the popular opposition now threatened to free Venezuela's few remaining slaves, perhaps leading to a war between the races. Although the Americans in Caracas did not believe that slavery could be preserved, they still hoped that the United States might send its West Indian squadron to the Venezuelan coast. A show of naval force in restive multiracial Venezuela, as in unsteady enslaved Cuba, would warn the discontented spirits of this country that the power of the United States stood vigorously on the side of the white elite. But although Tyler's minions stood guard all across the Americas, the most critical front in the Cold War over race and labor emerged directly on U.S. borders. It concerned the effort to protect bondage in what was, by the early 1840s, the fourth largest outpost of slavery in the hemisphere, the Republic of Texas. Historians have approached the 1845 U.S. annexation of Texas from a variety of perspectives. Some have seen it as a triumph of expansionist manifest destiny, others as an act of racial imperialism toward Mexico, a Southern plot to add slave states to the Senate, an electioneering tactic for the Democratic Party, or simply the fruit of ravenous land speculation. In some measure, of course, annexation was all these things. But for influential Southern leaders, Texas was above all a slave-holding republic in the Western Hemisphere. As such, it quite naturally required U.S. support, and, if necessary, U.S. protection. Threatened by abolitionist forces from both Great Britain and Mexico, the Lone Star Republic represented a key arena in the larger battle over the future of slavery. In American history textbooks, Texas often appears in tandem with Oregon and California, but in the early 1840s its more natural companions were Cuba and Brazil. For the key Southern leaders involved in annexation, the most critical balance of power was not sectional or senatorial, but international and hemispheric. American statesmen had long looked to the Mexican province of Texas with an ill-concealed sense of expectation. Given its vast potential to grow sugar and cotton, Thomas Jefferson predicted, "Texas will be the richest state of our Union." But if Jefferson's generation had assumed that Texas, like Cuba, would soon fall into the orbit of the United States, the national leaders that followed did little to speed up the process. In their 1819 treaty with Spain, President James Monroe and Secretary of State John Quincy Adams abandoned the shaky American claim to Texas in exchange for certain rights to Florida. The question of southwestern expansion then remained largely dormant for another decade or more. By the mid-1830s, however, rapid slaveholding settlement in the Mississippi Valley, together with the looming specter of British abolitionism, helped produce a different set of attitudes toward the Southwest. When American settlers in Texas revolted against Mexican rule in 1835, Southerners in the United States needed little prompting to identify the political stakes involved. Most American rhetorical support for the Texas Revolution was either loftily Republican or sordidly racist, but underneath it all were signs that Southerners understood the conflict's implications for the future of slave labor. In the Senate, Robert J. Walker of Mississippi celebrated the 1836 Texan victory at San Jacinto as a triumph for both white supremacy and the security of slave property. The United States, Walker proclaimed, could never have allowed Mexico to establish a government of Zambos and mestizos, of Africans and mulattoes on the borders of Louisiana and Arkansas, a people prepared to unite with and instigate the people of their own colored race within our limits to deeds of bloodshed and massacre. A Mexican victory in Texas, as Walker understood it, would threaten the racial and social organization of the slave states. In the decade that followed San Jacinto, this formulation came to govern all American foreign policy in the region. As Anglo-American tensions mounted in the 1840s, and as the outlines of a conscious foreign policy of slavery emerged, elite Southerners kept their eyes trained toward the Southwest. The spring of 1842 saw an outpouring of anxieties about the prospect of a joint British-Mexican effort to purge slavery from the larger region. One Charleston editor worried that Mexico had received secret assurances of support from England, prompting a renewed effort to reconquer its lost province. The New Orleans Commercial Bulletin trembled at the prospect of such an invasion. The Mexican army marches into Texas as avowed abolitionist, warned its editors, citing a recent manifesto issued by Mexican President Antonio López de Santa Anna. Without Texas as a buffer state between Louisiana and Mexico, the slaveholders of the Gulf South would face mortal danger. On the floor of Congress, Henry Wise took the lead in denouncing the Anglo-Mexican threat to continental slavery. The tyrant of Mexico, he declared in April 1842, was now at war with Texas and had threatened that he would invade her territory and never stop till he had driven slavery beyond the Sabine, the river boundary between Texas and the southern United States. His face no doubt assuming its familiar expression of livid pallor, Wise raised the horrifying prospect that Mexican arms might drive back the slaves of Texas upon Louisiana and Arkansas. But what most marked his 1842 speech was the alacrity with which he transformed the Mexican anti-slavery threat into an opening for American pro-slavery expansion. If Texas would only proclaim a crusade against the rich states to the south of her, he declared, Americans from across the Mississippi Valley would flock to her standard, and no feeble Mexican resistance could break their advance. And would not all this extend the bounds of slavery? Wise asked, anticipating potential Northern objections to his vision. Yes, and the result would be that before another quarter of a century the extension of slavery would not stop short of the Western Ocean. Wise had indulged himself in a remarkably candid statement of pro-slavery imperialism. Although he attempted to frame his discussion in terms of old Jeffersonian arguments about the diffusion of slavery, whereby the spread of bondage abroad enabled its removal from the United States, the actual opponents of slavery in Congress did not receive the speech in this spirit. John Quincy Adams mocked Wise's braggadocio, likening Wise's heroic enterprise to a sort of crusade in which the gentleman from Virginia is likely to transcend the exploits of Tamerlane and Genghis Khan. His adversaries might have scoffed, but Wise's speech, delivered 5 years before U.S. troops occupied Mexico City, remains noteworthy as an odd example of Southern grandiosity actually vindicated by future events. Wise's remarks also combined two critical elements with the foreign policy of slavery: concern for slave property beyond U.S. borders, coupled with a belief in the U.S. government's ability to protect that same slave property. In 1843, the Tyler administration began its campaign to bring the Lone Star Republic into the Union, thus keeping slaves on both sides of the U.S.-Texas border safe from British abolitionists and Mexican armies alike. In their private correspondence and public remarks, pro-annexation Southerners stressed the danger to regional slavery as a major rationale for annexation. To win national support for the measure, of course, they offered other arguments, that Texas would be a boon to the national economy and a market for northern manufacturers, a key addition to block British encirclement from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up to Canada, and most disingenuously, a safety valve for the ultimate diffusion of American slavery. But for the Southerners who led the annexation effort, Tyler, Upshur, and Calhoun, all these nationalistic hopes rested atop the essential foundation of slavery. Texas's gifts to the national economy, after all, would come primarily through the extension of the Cotton Empire to the banks of the Rio Grande. The danger of British encirclement, meanwhile, was above all a danger to Southern slavery, already menaced by the black troop garrisons of the emancipated West Indies. And the central point of the famous safety valve argument that slaves would flock to Texas in droves provoked no dispute from Southern annexationists. The cynical corollary was that the great exodus would drain the South of its slaves, but this, of course, was intended for credulous Northern audiences only. Slaveholders themselves knew better. Texas annexation was organized to defend and enlarge the field of slave labor, not to scatter it abroad uselessly. In January 1843, former Virginia Governor Thomas W. Gilmer introduced the subject that would dominate the national political conversation for the next 2 years. In a public letter quickly reprinted by the Tyler administration's official organ, the Madisonian, Gilmer argued that the United States should annex the Republic of Texas. The Virginian downplayed the significance of slavery and presented a neutrally economic and geopolitical case for U.S. annexation. But his letter opened a serious discussion of the real subject, the threat that British abolitionism posed to an independent but vulnerable Texas Republic. In his correspondence with Gilmer, the Texas politician Mamukin Hunt envisioned an anti-slavery strike against Texas that might in its way represent a greater danger than the Mexican army. It would be easy, he wrote, for the government of Great Britain through her Abolition Society in London to introduce a population sufficient under the colonization contracts now existing in Texas to pass a law abolishing slavery. Transforming the Lone Star Republic into an independent non-slave-holding state would be a dreadful calamity for the United States. Only the American annexation of Texas, Hunt concluded, could prevent this nightmare from becoming reality. He was hardly the only pro-slavery figure to follow this logic to its conclusion. Andrew Jackson, now living out his old age at the Hermitage in Tennessee, offered up his own nightmare scenario, thick with graphic detail. Great Britain enters into an alliance with Texas. Looking forward to war with us, she sends to Texas 20 or 30,000, marches through Louisiana and Arkansas, excites the Negroes to insurrection, and a servile war rages all over the southern and western country. As was often the case, Old Hickory's terse misspellings seemed only to add heat and urgency to his argument. To disrupt the military threat posed by a possible Anglo-Texan alliance, and to protect the slaveholding states from ruin, the United States must acquire Texas. In Washington, President Tyler had kept Texas in the back of his mind almost since he entered the White House. Beyond his very real concerns about slave property along the Gulf of Mexico, Tyler knew that the acquisition of Texas might be the diplomatic masterstroke he needed to build support for a possible re-election campaign. Yet it was not coincidental that his administration's annexation effort began in earnest only in 1843. Political ambition played a part in the drive for Texas, but both the underlying rationale and the immediate impetus for annexation emerged from the logic of the foreign policy of slavery. The ubiquitous Duff Green was again at the center of the action. From London, Tyler's ambassador of slavery informed the president that he had uncovered fresh evidence of an abolitionist plot against Texas. The British government, Green alleged, was providing secret aid for anti-slavery propaganda in the Lone Star Republic, and might even offer the cash-strapped Texas government a direct loan in exchange for emancipation. This scheme fit perfectly with Green's interpretation of British foreign policy across the hemisphere. So long as Cuba, Brazil, and the United States raise sugar, coffee, and cotton by slave labor, they will drive the products of English East and West Indies out of the market. By emancipating the bound laborers of Texas, Green argued, Britain would create a depot for runaway slaves, which, along with the Indians on the western border, could be used to threaten slavery in the United States. Here was an abomination whose horror could be suggested only by the grimmest of conceivable analogies. As a Texas government official put it in a June letter to Calhoun, Britain hoped to raise up a Negro nation, a sort of Haiti on the continent. Not for the first time, these pro-slavery observers radically overestimated the depth of Britain's commitment to anti-slavery action in the Gulf of Mexico. Although several local British agents worked intermittently to combat the extension of slavery in Texas, Sir Robert Peel's government in London sought most of all to avoid an Anglo-American clash in the region. Nevertheless, in the spring of 1843, the Tyler administration leaped into action. Secretary of State Webster resigned and was replaced first by Hugh Legarrette of South Carolina, and then, after Legarrette's sudden death, by Abel P. Upshur. The new secretary, of course, shared Greene's general view about the danger that British abolitionism posed for the entire hemispheric slave system. Within months of arriving at the State Department, Upshur received valuable new intelligence from a surprising source, the British minister in Washington, Henry S. Fox. In early August, Fox approached Upshur with a problem of some delicacy. The British West Indies, he confessed, was suffering severely in their productive industry from a dearth of agricultural laborers. Would the Tyler administration help encourage laborers of the free-colored class to emigrate to the Caribbean? Upshur briskly rejected Fox's proposal, but here, from the lion's mouth, came fresh proof that the free labor experiment in the Caribbean had failed, and thus oblique corroboration of the theory behind British imperial abolitionism. Perhaps Britain's hemispheric crusade against slavery had grown even more desperate than Upshur had previously understood. After all, this was the same summer in which the excitable Robert Monroe Harrison in Jamaica had warned Washington about a far-ranging Anglo-Caribbean plot to stir up a slave insurrection in Cuba. Well before he encountered Duff Greene's reports, Henry Fox's confessions, or Harrison's alarms, Upshur believed that British abolitionism posed an existential threat to American slavery. But it was only in the summer of 1843 that he and other powerfully placed Southerners grasped the immediacy of the danger. Now was the time to move. In late August, Calhoun wrote Upshur with a detailed plan of action. From any other source, the letter might have sounded like an arrogant set of instructions for the sitting Secretary of State, but the South Carolinian saw himself, with some justice, as a kind of presiding guru for Tyler's foreign policy team. Calhoun instructed the administration to demand an explanation from Great Britain, issue a forcible statement about the danger of Texas abolition, and privately reassure the Texas government of American friendly feelings and disposition. Meanwhile, U.S. representatives in Mexico, France, and Prussia should be empowered to baffle, as far as it may be possible, British plans in Texas. In fact, Upshur had already embarked on a similarly aggressive program. Earlier in August, he had warned William S. Murphy, the U.S. chargé d'affaires in Texas, of Great Britain's general plan to abolish domestic slavery throughout the entire continent and islands of America. The United States, Upshur wrote, have a high interest to counteract this attempt, and the struggle must begin in Texas. Although it was too early to promise the Texans that they would be annexed, Upshur knew that getting congressional approval for the measure would be difficult. He made it clear to Murphy in late September that the Tyler administration had every desire to come to the aid of Texas in the most prompt and effectual manner. By October, Upshur was speaking regularly with the Texas representative in Washington about the shape of a possible annexation treaty. Fearing both British interference and domestic political uproar, administration officials kept these discussions quiet. But by the second half of 1843, they were all firmly committed to the project of annexation. The Madisonians spent much of that autumn sounding the alarm about the British plots in Texas, whose ultimate aim could only be printed in screaming capitals: the abolition of slavery in America. Like-minded Southern newspapers blazed forth on the British threat to slave states in the Gulf of Mexico, a phrase that in the Charleston Mercury's telling usage referred not to the American South, but the foreign states of Cuba and Texas. And in private, administration men were candid about their goals. Acquiring Texas for the United States, Upshur wrote Tucker in October, was now the great object of my ambition. I do not care to control any measure of policy except this. As always, the principal Southerners involved in the annexation effort framed their labors in a larger international context. Calhoun could not counsel Upshur on Texas policy without also proposing a transatlantic guarantee for Spanish control of Cuba. To protect slavery on one end of the Gulf of Mexico, while seeing it destroyed on the other, would be no victory at all. Upshur, meanwhile, could not discuss the politics of annexation without invoking the hemispheric landscape. Great Britain's inability to compete with the slave labor of the United States, Texas, and Brazil, he reminded Murphy, was at the root of all British abolitionism. The hemispheric context mattered because the struggle over Texas was not simply about political control over valuable territory, but the fundamental relationship between free and bound labor in the Americas. Leading Southern annexationists returned frequently to the language of pro-slavery interdependence, the idea that a threat to slavery anywhere was a threat to slavery everywhere. If France should abolish slavery in her colonies, wrote the Alabamian who represented the United States in Paris, Spain and Brazil will be compelled to yield to the pressure which will be brought to bear upon them, and the United States will be left alone with the whole civilized world against her. France's few Caribbean possessions contained just 200,000 slaves, fewer than the number of bondspeople in Alabama, and a tiny fraction of New World slavery as a whole. But such was the fragile unity of the hemispheric system Southerners feared that even the slightest of slavery's dominoes could topple the entire institution. The precarious alignment of forces meant that in Texas, as in Cuba, the preservation of slavery sometimes seemed to overshadow the comparatively smaller question of political allegiance. For Waddy Thompson of South Carolina, the U.S. minister in Mexico City, the importance of slavery in Texas outweighed even the fate of annexation. If Texas could be re-annexed to Mexico, he suggested in 1844, with the toleration of slavery and a merely nominal supremacy of Mexico, I do not see any cause of regret on our part. But in practice, the secure embrace of the American Union generally seemed the best guarantee for slave property in Texas. For Upshur, the worst possible case was the establishment of Texas as an independent government, forbidding the existence of slavery placed in the very midst of our slaveholding states. This scenario would be even more dangerous than the existing contiguity of slaveholding and non-slaveholding states of our Union. The U.S. Constitution, after all, guarantees all the rights of the slaveholder, and there is an act of Congress which provides the means for enforcing them. As the shipwrecked slave cases had shown, no such overarching legal framework could protect these rights beyond U.S. borders. On the world stage, American power remained the slaveholders' most trusted ally. None of this meant that Texas annexation would be simple. Between 1843 and 1845, it required Southern leaders to overcome the resistance of the Whig Party, the fickleness of the Texas government, and the combined opposition of British and Mexican diplomacy. These obstacles demanded a commitment to the hemispheric defense of slavery that transcended traditional Southern and democratic principles, states' rights, a strict construction of the Constitution, and decentralized federal power. But in their furious efforts to make Texas safe for slavery, Southerners in the Tyler and Polk administrations bypassed these potential ideological hurdles with impressive ease. In the mid-1840s, the foreign policy of slavery proved nearly impervious to domestic political restraints. The imperious duty of the federal government. For years, the presence of Edward Everett as the American minister to Great Britain had rankled Abel Upshur. A Southern man and a slaveholder, not a Massachusetts abolitionist, he complained, should represent U.S. interests in London. In the fall of 1843, his desire for an explicitly slaveholding diplomatic corps grew more insistent. Mr. Everett, Upshur told Calhoun, is from the wrong side of Mason and Dixon. We should be represented in England by someone who understands domestic slavery. For his part, Duff Green fretted about American representation on the continent. Since the slave question is the question of the day, he wrote Upshur, no one north of the Potomac is suited to represent us at London, Paris, or Madrid. Without proper representation or agency, the Southern-born U.S. consul in Paris argued pro-slavery forces in France risked losing the diplomatic war against abolitionism. In the end, Tyler left Everett in Britain, but replaced the outgoing minister to France with William R. King, a moderate in his native Alabama, but unquestionably a Southern man and a slaveholder on the world stage. It is tempting to see such Southern insistence on slaveholding diplomats as evidence of a fiercely sectional political consciousness. Upshur and other Southerners did occasionally bring such a spirit to the Texas question. Annexation, he told Calhoun, is a Southern question and not one of Whiggism and democracy. The Southern people are far, far too lethargic upon this vital question. They ought to be roused and made of one mind. This was the kind of talk that has fueled historical treatments of Texas annexation as primarily or exclusively sectional in character. But despite Calhoun's commitment to a purified Southern politics and Upsher's desire to energize the South, even the most sectional Texas annexationists ultimately understood the question in national terms. Their center of operations, after all, was not Charleston or New Orleans, but Washington, at the State Department office on Pennsylvania Avenue. The chief threat to bondage in the 1840s came not from northern rabble-rousers, but the imperial abolitionism of Great Britain. To vanquish that threat, slaveholding elites could not act as representatives of a minority regional interest. They had to wield the national power of the United States. In his letter to the U.S. envoy in Texas, Upsher contrasted the world of international relations, hostile and dangerous to slavery, with domestic American life, where the U.S. Constitution offered the strongest possible bulwark for slave property. He even dared imagine that American politics might become more sympathetic to bondage. The slaveholder of the United States has not yet lost hope that all the embarrassments which individuals or states have thrown in the way of that property may be removed by the quiet action of our own system. Although pro-Texas Southerners understood the importance of the sectional balance of power within the Union, they remained confident that slaveholding interests would come out on top. As Calhoun put it, a strong South cannot fail to control the other and more disordered sections. His major domestic antagonist, Andrew Jackson, agreed. The rising greatness of the South and West would define the future of the American Republic. It is this sense of confident expectation in regard to American slavery that historians have sometimes overlooked in accounts of the Southern push for Texas. To be sure, Upshur and his fellow maestros of annexation had their moments of darkness and pessimism. Genuine anxiety about Northern population growth and the control of Congress inflected the worldviews of the men who led the campaign for Texas. But this sectional defensiveness also mingled with a deep well of confidence in American power, and the Southern ability to manipulate that power for the protection and benefit of slavery. In 1843 and 1844, that confidence encouraged Upshur, Tyler, and the others to push the boundaries of expansionist diplomacy as they had seldom been pushed before. Upshur may have believed in the Constitution as a conservative safeguard for slaveholding, but he did not intend to let its restrictions on executive power obstruct his campaign for Texas. In this, he was joined by nearly all the slaveholders involved in the annexation project. Even Upshur's old Virginia friend, Nathaniel Beverly Tucker, the author of The Partisan Leader, set aside some ideological scruples when it came to Texas. In December 1843, Upshur wrote Tucker to seek advice on the form of a possible annexation treaty. Did the Texas leadership have a legal right to transfer the country via a diplomatic agreement without the consent of the people? How shall this be managed? This legalistic fussing was more than a little disingenuous. Already deep in negotiations with the Texas chargé d'affaires in Washington, the Secretary of State knew that he had little time to spare on such fine theoretical dilemmas. Without waiting for a response to his opening question, he asked Tucker to draft the preamble of a treaty and the clauses transferring the territory. Tucker agreed to help. Constitutional and legal objections in this context were problems to be managed, not seriously contemplated. The fate of slavery on the continent was too large a question to be left to philosophical timidity. By late 1843, the major obstacle to an annexation treaty was Texas President Sam Houston, who still dreamed of a glorious independent future for the Lone Star Republic. Finally, Houston agreed to begin work on a treaty, but only if the Tyler administration provided a military guarantee against a Mexican attack during negotiations. Such a formal promise would be flagrantly unconstitutional. It would commit the United States to a war with Mexico at the behest of a foreign power, without the input or consent of Congress. Even Tyler and Upshur could not go so far. Beyond any principled objections, they knew that if this kind of guarantee were made public, it might put the entire annexation project in political danger. Nevertheless, Upshur assured the Texas representative in Washington that the administration would do the next best thing. He promised to send a large armed force to the border while concentrating a U.S. naval squadron off the Texas coast. Tyler's envoy, W.S. Murphy, went a step further. Neither Mexico nor any other power, he promised Texas officials, will be permitted to invade Texas on account of any negotiation which may take place. Although the administration later officially disavowed Murphy's illegitimate guarantee, In February 1844, it helped coax Houston into giving his crucial blessing for an annexation agreement. The same month, however, Abel Upsher's plans for annexation suffered a gruesomely ironic setback. On February 12th, Captain Robert F. Stockton steamed into the Potomac aboard the USS Princeton, a new screw-propeller sloop and the pride of the Navy. A tangible product of Upsher's modernizing campaign as Secretary of the Navy, the Princeton carried unusually high-powered weaponry for a sloop of war, 24 42-pound cannon, plus 2 enormous 12-inch guns, each capable of pulverizing iron and wood targets at a distance of 3 miles. In its continual quest for naval funding, the Tyler administration often sought to dazzle legislators with the display of high-tech warships. Upsher, as Navy Secretary, had invited Congress to the Potomac in 1842 to examine 2 new specimens of American naval architecture. Now Tyler and his new Secretary of the Navy, early Texas annexation advocate Thomas Gilmer, pulled out all the stops for the Princeton. A week after its arrival in Washington, Congress adjourned so that its members could visit the ship. The skeptical John Quincy Adams grumbled that the exhibition was intended primarily to fire their souls with patriotic ardor for a naval war. On February 27, Tyler invited Stockton to a public reception in the East Room of the White House in preparation for a gala excursion to the Princeton the following day. Upsher did not attend, instead staying up late in his office to finalize the annexation treaty he had only just hammered out with Texas Chargé Isaac Van Zandt. The next morning, however, he joined the President, Secretary Gilmer, and other Washington luminaries, including the 76-year-old Dolly Madison, aboard the Princeton. By late afternoon, the heaviest of the ship's 2 12-inch guns, the Peacemaker, had already been fired twice, to the delight of the assembled party. While most of the guests, including Tyler, went below to enjoy a sumptuous collation of food and drink, Secretary Gilmer persuaded Stockton to fire the massive gun once more. This time the Peacemaker exploded from the inside out, spewing shards of red-hot iron across the deck and killing Upsher, Gilmer, and 7 others. In the aftermath of the disaster, Tyler knew that the delicate state of Texas diplomacy meant he had to act quickly to find Upsher's replacement in the State Department. Within 10 days of the tragedy, the President nominated John C. Calhoun. It was a natural choice. Given the administration's larger foreign policy goals, perhaps no figure in American politics made more sense. Upsher had leaned heavily on Calhoun for advice throughout his tenure at the State Department. On the central questions of British imperial abolitionism and the hemispheric defense of slavery, the two held almost identical views. Yet Upsher had mostly managed to camouflage his aggressive goals with quiet diplomacy, rhetorical restraint, and secretive correspondence. Calhoun took a different approach. Equally committed to the foreign policy of slavery, he saw less reason to disguise his worldview for either domestic or international audiences. In the spring of 1844, at least, this made him much less effective than his predecessor. Before his death, Upsher had expressed confidence that his private lobbying efforts had persuaded more than the necessary 2/3 of the Senate to ratify the treaty. When the finished document was presented to Congress in April, however, Calhoun's correspondence with the British minister in Washington, Richard Pakenham, disturbed this delicate alignment. Responding to the accusations leveled by Duff Green, the Madisonian, and other American sources, Pakenham and his Foreign Secretary Lord Aberdeen had publicly denied that Great Britain had any plans to interfere in Texas. Although Aberdeen admitted that Britain shall not desist from those open and honest efforts which we have constantly made for procuring the abolition of slavery throughout the world, he disavowed any intention to upset the internal tranquility of either Texas or the American Union. This half-hearted denial failed to satisfy Calhoun. Less than a week after the Texas annexation treaty was presented to Congress, the Secretary wrote back to Pakenham with more spirit and candor than Upsher had ever allowed himself as the public mouthpiece of the State Department. Britain's Cold War on slavery, Calhoun argued, made it the duty of all other countries whose safety or prosperity may be endangered by her policy to adopt such measures as they may deem necessary for their protection. By 1844, this notion of a pro-slavery community of nations came easily to Calhoun, and he cited it as a fundamental reason for the current program of annexation. The American absorption of Texas was the most effectual, if not the only, means of guarding against the threatened danger of British anti-slavery. In the second half of his letter, Calhoun went even further, plunging into an extended statistical analysis that confirmed slavery as a positive good. The Secretary pronounced black slavery in the American South a wise and humane institution, while decrying the vice and pauperism of free Northern blacks. The careful foreign policy of slavery morphed, rather suddenly, into a strident defense of bondage. Calhoun's inflammatory letter to Pakenham halted the momentum of the annexation treaty in Congress. Although Southern newspapers had long denounced Britain's international war on slavery, the administration had not made its public case for Texas on pro-slavery grounds. President Tyler, although doubtless sympathetic to Calhoun's logic, had scrupulously avoided mentioning the slavery issue when he presented the Texas Treaty to the Senate. With most Whigs, even Southern Whigs, opposed to annexation, the treaty required near unanimous support from Northern Democrats to gain the necessary two-thirds vote. When Calhoun turned the Texas issue into a debate about slavery, Northern expansionists withdrew their support. In June, the Senate rejected annexation by the embarrassingly decisive count of 35-16. Yet this would not be the final word on the Texas question. 1844, after all, was an election year. In April, both Henry Clay, the leading Whig candidate for president, and Martin Van Buren, the leading Democrat, made public statements opposing the immediate annexation of Texas. The door was open for a pro-Texas candidate to squeeze into the election. At the Democratic convention in Baltimore, a determined brigade of Southerners successfully blocked Van Buren's nomination. After multiple ballots, the eventual nominee, James K. Polk of Tennessee, emerged on a platform of immediate and uncompromising annexation. The political battle between Polk and Clay kept the Texas question very much alive throughout the summer and fall of 1844. In the meantime, Tyler and Calhoun began to explore other possibilities for annexation. If they could not procure a two-thirds majority in the Senate, perhaps it was possible to manage a joint resolution of Congress, requiring only simple majorities in the House and Senate. Tyler and his cohort did not appear troubled by the idea that the United States had never before added state-sized pieces of territory without ratifying a formal treaty. In 1803, some strict constructionists had felt that Thomas Jefferson had overstepped his bounds in acquiring Louisiana by treaty rather than a constitutional amendment. Now Tyler argued that even a treaty was unnecessary. The power of Congress alone was fully competent to permit the Union to swallow an entire foreign republic, hundreds of thousands of square miles in size. By now it was clear that only political reality, not constitutional restraint, could prevent Tyler from annexing Texas. Within the State Department, Calhoun continued to use the Texas debate as a means to stretch the geographic and ideological boundaries of pro-slavery politics. His August letter to the new minister to France, William King, contained yet another impassioned attack on British abolitionism, joined to yet another stentorian defense of bondage. But what was most striking about this King letter, as it came to be known, was the clear intention that it be used as international pro-slavery propaganda. The triumph of British abolitionism in Texas, Calhoun declared, would produce a war of races all over South America, including Mexico, and extending to the Indian as well as the African race, and making the whole scene one of blood and devastation. France and the other great continental powers, Calhoun argued, had no interest in such a disaster. Is it not better for them that they should be supplied with tropical products in exchange for their labor from the United States, Brazil, Cuba, and this continent generally? At home, Southerners cheered Calhoun's magnificent exposé of British abolition. "You have thrown a hand grenade into their canting camp," wrote one ally, while suspicious Northerners in Congress demanded to see the Secretary's full correspondence with Paris. But both friends and enemies alike recognized that the King letter's significance lay beyond the traditional borders of the sectional conflict. His South Carolina friend, James Gadsden, thought Calhoun deserved the gratitude of the world, where trade is stimulated by the production of black and slave labor. The anti-slavery press complained that he had proposed a grand slaveholding league of Brazil, Spain, and France, with the United States at its head. Calhoun could hardly have put it better himself. Under the Secretary's direction, the State Department distributed the King letter to Texas, Brazil, and all our diplomatic agents in Europe. From Rio de Janeiro, where he had yet to stir up trouble with his host, Henry Wise reported that Mr. Calhoun's letter to Mr. King had a good effect here in encouraging the Brazilian government to resist British abolitionism. In Paris, King received the dispatch with enthusiasm, adding only a request for Secret Service funds to place articles in the Paris papers calculated to disabuse the public mind here as to the actual condition of the slaves of our country. Calhoun sent him the money, along with a confidential and even more explicit statement about the white supremacist alliance he had hinted at in his August letter. England, he warned, had become the patron of the colored races of all hues, Negroes, Indians, and mixed, against the white. France must join the global forces ranged against this abolitionist horde. In the end, it is unclear whether Calhoun and King's pro-slavery politicking had much impact on French policy. But over the course of 1844-45, France ultimately refused to participate in even tentative British efforts to oppose the American annexation of Texas. Calhoun also extended Upsher's efforts to provide the strongest possible security guarantee to anxious Texans who worried that another Mexican invasion loomed in the fall. What could the U.S. military do to help Texas without the consent of Congress? According to one Texas official in Washington, Calhoun was the administration's most case-hardened advocate of intervention. Had he the power, the Army would doubtless be ordered right into Texas to repel any attack against her. In September, the Secretary of State found a rationale that might provide sufficient cover for the administration to deploy American troops. Pierce Butler, U.S. agent to the Cherokee and Indian Territory, had accused the Mexican government of instigating the Indian tribes on our southwestern frontier. By the terms of the U.S.-Mexico Treaty of 1831, Calhoun concluded the United States was authorized to send troops into Texas to restrain any possible Indian incursions into the area. In truth, by 1844, most of the vast plains encompassing western Texas and northern Mexico were under the effective dominion of a powerful Comanche-led empire. The Comanches, Kiowas, and other tribes in the region needed little incitement or assistance from the Mexican government, which could barely sustain its own northern settlements against Indian attacks, let alone manipulate the Indians. No further evidence against Mexico ever surfaced to support the accusations made by Butler, a former South Carolina governor and Calhoun confidant. But it was characteristic of both U.S.-Mexican relations and the foreign policy of slavery that Calhoun drew on the threat of Indian attack to bypass Congress and secure troops for Texas. In November, James K. Polk narrowly defeated Henry Clay to win the presidential election. "The Republic is safe," crowed Andrew Jackson. "Texas is sure under Polk's administration to be annexed to the United States." Tyler and Calhoun, however, were determined not to wait until Polk took office. As soon as Congress reconvened in December, the lame duck administration and its allies pushed forward the joint resolutions on Texas. Congressional critics considered the effort an outrageous and hypocritical abuse of the Constitution. "It was not a little surprising," remarked New York Democrat George Rathbun, "that a gentleman from South Carolina, considered as the standard-bearer of strict construction, should be the author of this annexation policy." Calhoun could not hear of an appropriation for opening a harbor, improving a railroad, cutting a canal, or chartering a bank, because the power to perform these things is not specifically granted in the Constitution. But he was now eager to swallow a sovereign state without ratifying a formal treaty. Still, the advocates of annexation pressed forward in Congress. After a long debate, the House passed a resolution admitting Texas into the Union under conditions very similar to Tyler's original treaty. In the Senate, skeptical Northern Democrats, led by Thomas Hart Benton, demanded further discussion on the timing and circumstances of annexation, especially in regard to border disputes between Texas and Mexico. Finally, by a tight vote of 27 to 25, the Senate passed a resolution admitting Texas as a state, but giving the President discretion to conduct additional negotiations with Texas authorities. After meeting with President-elect Polk, Benton's faction in the Senate acted under the impression that the incoming administration would proceed with these additional talks to set the terms of annexation. But at a cabinet meeting 2 days before their terms of office expired, President Tyler and Secretary of State Calhoun decided that more negotiations would risk further British meddling in Texas. It was enough, Tyler remembered later, that Congress had given me the power to act by the terms of the resolutions, and that the urgency of the case was imminent. The outgoing administration determined to flout expectations and move to acquire Texas at once, under the loosest understanding possible. By the time Polk took office, the wheels of annexation were already in motion. Tyler's aggressive decision, undertaken in the waning hours of his presidency, caught both supporters and opponents of the Senate compromise off guard. In his diary, James Henry Hammond confessed to misgivings about acquiring Texas by joint resolution. The constitutionality of it I think doubtful. Still, he rejoiced in the larger success of annexation, for it was an event of great magnitude and strengthens the South and the slave interest. For neither the first nor last time in antebellum political history, cold principle dissolved before the demands of hot ambition. Beyond expediency, however, a deeper logic guided the Southern annexationists. Their willingness to use all the muscle and machinery of the federal government to obtain Texas reflected their larger view of U.S. power in foreign affairs. As Northern opponents of annexation observed, the new territory would further enhance the military capacity of the nation. The acquisition of Texas, Joshua Giddings told Congress, will require a large increase of our army, an extensive circle of fortifications, and an expansion of our naval armament in order that slavery might be protected there as well. John Quincy Adams offered an even more vivid picture of how Texas would further the growth of the United States as an imperial behemoth. This Texas annexation we deem the turning point of a revolution which transforms the North American Confederation into a conquering and warlike nation. Aggrandizement will be its passion and its policy. A military government, a large army, a costly navy, distant colonies and associate islands in every sea will follow, of course, in rapid succession. Giddings and Adams latched onto something real. Tyler and his allies would not have characterized their project in those terms, but as a rule they proved willing to expand the powers of the central government in order to complete the project of annexation. The British attempt to abolish slavery in Texas, Calhoun stressed in his letter to Pakenham, required an unequivocally national response. It is felt to be the imperious duty of the federal government, the common representative and protector of the states of this union, to adopt in self-defense the most effectual measures to defeat it. In the debate over the joint resolutions, Virginia Congressman Thomas Bailey laid out the constitutional reasoning behind the administration's policy. There are two classes of powers conferred upon the general government, Bailey explained, the one relating to our foreign and other to our domestic relations. Under America's wise system, there is a plenary delegation of power to the general government in all that concerns of external affairs, and a restricted delegation in what relates to our domestic. Thus, liberal construction should be observed in the former area, but strict construction in the latter. Given the obvious importance of Texas to us as a means of military defense, Bailey hoped that Congress would grant the administration all conceivable latitude in managing its annexation. Southerners may have understood these arguments as useful justifications for a Texas policy that was governed by sectional self-interest, not larger political ideas. But they may also have simply meant what they said. For Tyler, Calhoun, and others, the federal government represented the strongest and most reliable weapon for the defense of hemispheric slavery. It stood to reason that they interpreted its international powers liberally. The founders of the Republic, one pro-Texas essayist argued, took an expansive attitude toward the duties of the federal government in strengthening our frontiers and fortifying the defenses of freedom. Their views were broad, capacious, and eminently national. In the 1840s, the Southerners in charge of American foreign policy were more than content to apply this formulation to contemporary affairs. What, after all, could be more eminently national than the protection of American slavery? The annexation of Texas was perhaps the quintessential achievement of the foreign policy of slavery. The measure involved all the central aspects of that evolving program: feverish attention to the international balance between slavery and freedom, unquestioning belief in the power of the South to command American foreign policy, and the power of American foreign policy to command the world, and a willingness to bring the full weight of the U.S. government to bear on the question. Its realization brought despair to opponents of bondage on both sides of the Atlantic. The annexation of Texas looks like one of those events which retard or retrograde the civilization of the ages, wrote Ralph Waldo Emerson in Massachusetts. For the British historian T.B. Macaulay, America's Texas diplomacy defined the essence of its role on the world stage. The United States government has openly declared itself the patron, the champion, and the upholder of slavery. It renders itself illustrious as the evil genius of the African race. American leaders put themselves at the head of the slave interest, just as Queen Elizabeth put herself at the head of the Protestant interest in Europe. Just as Elizabeth's victories against Spain were triumphs for world Protestantism, so the American victory in Texas was a triumph for world slavery. Southern slaveholders celebrated their accomplishment in similar international terms. The acquisition of Texas, crowed Henry Wise in Brazil, confirmed America's monopoly of the cotton trade of the world. The balance of power between Great Britain and the United States would never be the same, declared Major William Chase, commandant of U.S. forces at Pensacola. A British ministry declaring war against the United States could not remain in power more than 48 hours. By the annexation of Texas, the United States have secured the monopoly of growing the great staple of the world. The South's international triumphalism, however, extended beyond the early stirrings of King Cotton. In a post-annexation speech, William Lowndes Yancey of Alabama called Congress's attention to the situation of the two rival industries of the world, the free and the slave labor. The former, though aided by the might of the world's greatest power, Great Britain, was falling behind, but the other, seeming to derive renewed vigor from the decaying fortunes of its rival, is springing forward with an elasticity and speed that will soon defy rivalry. Texas represented another jewel in the crown of world slavery. Under American protection, it would doubtless provide yet more evidence of the immense superiority of a system of associated slave labor over free individual labor in every species of tropical cultivation. In 1845, the Martinique planter Thomas Jolivet helped translate and publish a Paris edition of Calhoun's now famous King Letter, the lead item in a new collection of American pro-slavery writing aimed at French readers. Southern commentators cheered and clamored for more. All documents calculated to furnish foreign states with the arguments of the Southern states, urged one South Carolina magazine, should be sent abroad as widely and rapidly as possible. Perhaps the tide of international anti-slavery opinion was beginning to retreat, and Europe's common sense would soon assert its sway. After the successful annexation of Texas, pro-slavery propagandists had reason to feel that their cause might receive a fuller hearing both at home and abroad. Their optimism reflected the great strides the foreign policy of slavery had made in the 4 years since Tyler had entered the White House. To be sure, slavery's dominoes still arranged themselves precariously on the Atlantic game board. The specter of British abolitionism still loomed across the hemisphere. But thanks in part to American vigilance, none of the dominoes had fallen. The collective forces of anti-slavery, whether European, American, or African in origin, appeared to have made little headway in their battle against bondage in the Caribbean basin. Above all, the absorption of Texas into the American Union immeasurably strengthened the position of hemispheric slaveholders. As Memican Hunt had observed to Duff Green in early 1844, the slave interest is too small in North America to be maintained without molestation if held by two governments. To make it secure, one government should protect it all. By 1845, that one government was the United States, and its confidence in the sole possession of cotton and slavery was immense. In the years that followed, the Southerners at the helm of national power continued to look for ways to strengthen the slave interest in the Americas, both inside and outside the borders of the United States.